worst comes to worst, this will work.
Very good.
Cool. All right.
Let me pull my little script.
Hey everybody, so thank you to those watching at home. Just quick introduce ourselves. We are the Platypus Affiliate Society. We organize reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the old problems and tasks inherent from the old, the new, and the post-political left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics. Today, our teach-in titled, let me get it right, titled Provoking and Organizing the Pathology of the Left is being hosted by my good friend Daniel D. out of Columbia. He is a founding member of the South Carolina chapter of the Platypus Affiliate Society, and you are a trained and practicing psychoanalyst. I will give it away to you unless I'm forgetting anything. Oh, after this as well, we are going to Rusty Bowl on King Street for a quick bar night, pub night, whatever you want to call it. So if you want to join and continue talking to us, please do.
Okay, let's get started. So the epigraph to this teach-in is from Russell Jacoby's The Dialectic of Defeat, Contours of Western Marxism. A rough egalitarianism belongs to the 20th century. It has chopped down political hopes and beliefs of every stripe. From liberalism to Marxism, none has survived intact. Talk of the Gulag is hardly answered by talk of Auschwitz, nor can analysis of one replace analysis of the other. The wreckage extends in every direction. The vastness of the junkyard encourages, almost compels retreat and resignation. Yet, as Herbert Marcuse once remarked, there was no God that failed, only men and women. The debacle allows no escape. With care and caution, we must sift through the theoretical rubble. Marx and Weber and Freud remain our contemporaries, not because little of import has been said since they wrote, but because the society they dissected and sometimes denounced still wheezes along. The temptation to flee into the future and begin conceptually afresh is marked by fright, and it yields staler results than less ambitious efforts to think through the past, end quote. Jacoby's Dialectic of Defeat, Contours of Western Marxism, published nearly 50 years ago, still speaks to us despite the passing of its historical context and object, namely the seemingly intense ideological conflict of the Cold War and what Jacoby terms the overshadowing of so-called Western Marxism by the still existing Soviet model in his time and its structuralist variants. It speaks despite my cohort's coming and now going, namely the millennial left, and its failure to reconstitute a serious socialist politics. Perhaps it did not speak enough. Or rather, did the millennial left really try to make the past speak? Did we attune our hearing sufficiently to the echoes of history? Whether there will be any serious reflection of the millennial left, my generation, by its participants, outside of Platypus, as a historical object is yet to be seen, even as it, like the society it was born in, still wheezes along. Platypus's pronouncement of the death of the left is often misrecognized and misconstrued as referencing a recent downturn on the left, usually due to a recent defeat of the oldest, most powerful capitalist party, otherwise known as the Democrats, or a capitulation to a conservatizing view of history. Rather, one should read the text of Platypus attentively to discern the meaning of this seemingly obscure slogan, "The left is dead, long live the left." Of course, this inheritance is directly from Marx, the class struggles in France. "The revolution is dead, long live the revolution." Omer Hussein's article in Platypus Review 115, "What does it mean to say that Platypus is the psychoanalyst of the left?" offers an instructive corrective to the myriad of misreadings. Quote from Omer, "To say that the left is dead is not simply a moral condemnation of the existing left for failing to meet abstract criteria of being healthy or alive. Rather, the left is ill or dead according to its own history, in relation to what it once was and what it imagined itself to be." End quote. The accumulative vastness of the junkyard, or perhaps more accurately, graveyard, and its groundkeepers in the form of academics and activists have successfully tempted, frightened, and miseducated successive generations of would-be leftists to flee into the future, although any conceptual freshness is a misrecognition of an undigested and repressed historical accumulation of defeat and regression. Platypus is not the Platypus is not only the ambitious effort to think through, but to work through the past. This task is predicated on a historical judgment that this presentation will thematize. The presentation will utilize Georg Lukács's 1924 text, Lenin, A Study of the Unity of His Thought, as our privileged case study of a theoretical reflection of the historical left to render palpable its absence in our own time and the necessity of platypus. In this text, Lukács reflects on what he posits as the spiritual center of Lenin's personality. Quote from Lukács, "It indicates that my concern was not to reproduce his objective theoretical system, but rather to give an account of the objective and subjective forces that made this systematization and its embodiment in Lenin's persons and actions possible." End quote. Notably, this text was published around 1 month following Lenin's death in January 1924, and 1 year after Lukács's recently written History and Class Consciousness faced significant criticism from the Third International from deviating from orthodox Marxism. Despite these conditions, which entail the ebbing and ultimate closing of the revolutionary period, Lukács' genius lies in his unparalleled ability to grasp the significance of Lenin's thought. To better elucidate the disparity, both temporal and ideological, between Marx and Lenin's time and our own, part of our focus today will underscore what Lukács identified as Lenin's recognition of the actuality of the revolution. A deepening of our understanding of the core of Lenin's thought is essential for our case study. According to Lukács, the mediocre scholar focuses only on isolated moments of the social process and draws abstract conclusions based on phenomena that are limited in time and space. In contrast, Lenin grasps the subterranean historical tendencies of his age in every event, demonstrating that seemingly mundane, everyday matters are infused with significance of the world historic mission for socialism. Thus, Lukács' conceptual figure of the actuality of the revolution as the core of Lenin's thought will serve our purpose via negativa, in making evident not just the chronological distinctions, but also the ideological and practical contrast between the two periods, Lenin's and our own, and the necessity of provoking and organizing the pathology of the left, and this turn of phrase I owe my teacher and co-founder of Platypus, Spencer Leonard. Historical materialism, Lukács writes, is, quote, the theory of proletarian revolution. It is so because its essence is an intellectual synthesis of the social existence which produces and fundamentally determines the proletariat. And because the proletariat struggling for liberation finds its clear self-consciousness in it, end quote. In other words, historical materialism as an essential dimension of Marxism is irreducible to a philosophical or economic analysis. In fact, the reduction of Marxism to these academic exercises is one of the most potent indexes of its failure alongside those activists who raised the banner of Marxism to rationalize Democratic Party projects to expand the scope and power of the administrative state as a century of counter-revolution continues to unfold all around us. The necessity of the left as the critical self-consciousness of freedom in history is an indispensable prerequisite for the actuality of the revolution, the actuality of Marxism. Today it is the absence of the left that haunts us. As students in Platypus, we grasp that Marxism was the imminent dialectical critique of the proletarian movement for socialism, which pointed to the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Without its object of critique, the movement for socialism, the former, Marxism, ceases to exist in any meaningful sense. To return to Lukács as our via negativa, as our guiding via negativa in his study, he adumbrates a typical criticism of Marx and his method, namely that Marx generalized from particular socio-historical experiences constrained by time and space, the demiurge of the bourgeois cosmos, that is, quote, the English factory system in its social premises, its conditions, and consequences, end quote, and distorted these into general laws of social development. True to his Hegelianism, Marx, in his genuine historical and political genius, was able to grasp the unfolding of the totality in the particular, specifically the Industrial Revolution and its necessary association with the emergence of proletarian socialism. With the introduction of labor-saving machinery, labor-saving in quotes, which reduced socially necessary labor time for the production and reproduction of value, namely society as such, the crisis of the former manifested in rendering not work, but worker superfluous, as Horkheimer adduced long ago. This crisis is what Marx called capital, the contradiction between bourgeois social relations and forces of production, a crisis reaching its culmination in 1848 that would spread across the globe. 1848 would remain both the origin and goal of Marxism. The crisis of bourgeois society was driven by the proletarian movement for socialism that pointed both backward to the reconstitution of bourgeois society through the demand for bourgeois right, and forward, namely to the workers' task of taking responsibility for society as a whole through the conquest of political power, the dictatorship of the proletariat. In his study, Lukács contends that Lenin is also accused of grossly generalizing from socio-historical conditions. Despite Lenin's acknowledged political genius, both by opportunists and conservatives alike, akin to Marx, his historical limitation produces the error of generalizing, quote, uncritically the problems and solutions derived from Russian reality, applying them universally, end quote. Lukács avers that, like Marx, Lenin's generalization did not proceed from the parochial conditions of Russia constrained by time and space. Rather, he grasped the fundamental problem of his time, the approaching revolution, at the time and place of its first appearance, nothing less than the actuality of the revolution. Thus, Lenin grasped the problems of his age as a totality. Lenin therefore signals the arch-Hegelian inheritance of Marxism, namely the imperative of apprehending one's time and fault, which is why Engels famously adduced as an illustration of this dimension, the German working class movement is the inheritor of German classical philosophy. For Lukács, this formulation of Lenin's thought will reemerge in successive world historical events. To further punctuate what is at stake here with Lenin's generalization enabling the recognition of the actuality of the revolution, it is worth, quote, to quote Lukács at length. Quote, the actuality of the revolution, this is the core of Lenin's thought and his decisive link with Marx. For historical materialism as the conceptual expression of the proletariat struggle for liberation could only be conceived and formulated theoretically when the revolution was already on the historical agenda as a practical reality, when in the misery of the proletariat, in Marx's words, was to be seen not only the misery itself, but also the revolutionary element which will bring down the old order. Even at that time, it was necessary to have the undaunted insight of genius to be able to see the actuality of the proletarian revolution. For the average man first sees the proletarian revolution when the working masses are already fighting on the barricades, if he happens to have enjoyed a vulgar Marxist education, not even then. For to a vulgar Marxist, the foundations of bourgeois society are so unshakable that, even when they are visibly shaking, he only hopes and prays for a return to normality, sees its crisis as temporary episodes, and regards a struggle even at such times as an irrational and irresponsible rebellion against the ever-invincible capitalist system. To him, the fighters on the barricades are madmen, the defeated revolution is a mistake, and the builders of socialism in a successful revolution, which in the eyes of an opportunist can only be transitory, are outright criminals, end quote. Therefore, the struggle against opportunists, the vulgar Marxist, who in fact repudiate the actuality of the revolution prior to its imminent and palpable unfolding in 1917, the 1890s in Russia was a period of rapid industrialization, and this background renders the horizon of new social and political forces. The St. Petersburg strikes render the need for a party under conditions of suppression. Opportunism adapts to the suppression, the inertia of capitalism, by advocating for the liquidation of the party. A political judgment emerges that underlies the Iskras board to commission what we now know as what is to be done. Namely, the time had come to establish a political party. Lenin insisted that the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the RSDLP, had to inherit the pre-Marxian task of overthrowing the Tsarist government with the rapid industrialization with all sorts of foreign investment, thus creating a wave of strikes in the 1890s and working class militancy, creating the context for the party. Still, Lenin is concerned to say that the project is the seizure of power. It is critical in what way the working class is committed to seizing power. Only in a way that makes them socialist, not simply workerist or economist. They must inherit a politics brought from them by the bourgeois intelligentsia, from the outside. Part of that consciousness is that workers must be the vanguard in overthrowing the Tsar. This consciousness manifested as the tribune of the people, the newspaper. The newspaper is the language of the third estate of the bourgeois revolution. It is the inheritance of the bourgeois revolution. As Lukács observes, and I quote, "For the real revolution is the dialectical transformation of the bourgeois revolution into the proletarian revolution," end quote. Lenin deduces that the RSDLP must address the spontaneity of the spontaneity, namely the question of historical consciousness that is streaming through these movements. His opponents argue that the material conditions will drive the workers to revolution. Conversely, Lenin asserts that the task is to facilitate the workers' development so they can lead all classes in society. That is the subjective factor, otherwise known as class consciousness. This could be understood as a Russian rehearsal of the revisionist dispute, a crucial expression from the crisis of Marxism to the Russian milieu, demonstrating in some fundamental sense that backward conditions can produce advanced political consciousness in relation to the Second International. Lenin avers that ideological coherence in Russia that excludes the revisionists from the outset proves necessary as a function of the condition of the barbarism they have to contend with. Better fewer, but better. The task is to operate more effectively and thus more profoundly affect the working class, so these Sunday socialists don't get Lenin and his comrades busted and sent to Siberia. The revisionists in Germany were dealt with by party discipline, where the majority was revolutionary. Meanwhile, for the RSDLP, introducing opportunist elements at the dawn of the party meant inevitable defeat, thus necessitating a certain level of ideological coherence. What is essential for us is Lenin's generalization of the task of prosecuting the revisionist dispute points to the actuality of the revolution. It is worth quoting Lenin here. Quote, "At the present time, as is now evident, the English Fabians, the French ministerialists, the German Bernsteinians, and the Russian critics all belong to the same family, all extol each other, learn from each other, and take up arms together against dogmatic Marxism." In this first really international battle with socialist opportunism, international revolutionary social democracy will perhaps become sufficiently strengthened to put an end to the political reaction that has long reigned in Europe, end quote. Succinctly stated by Lukács, a period's revolutionary essence is expressed most clearly when class and inter-party struggles no longer take place within the existing state order, but begin to explode its barriers and point beyond them. Lukács views Lenin's remarkable acumen for historical judgment not only as his decisive link to Marx, but also as the means by which Lenin advances Marxism by returning to it. Lukács' chief intellectual comrade, Karl Korsch, most clearly articulates the concept of advancing through return. Quote from Korsch, and I quote, "This transformation and development of Marxist theory has been effected under the peculiar ideological guise of returning to the pure teaching of original or true Marxism." End quote. We should understand the process of advancing through return as a deepening of Marxism. It is the actualization of the revolution by liberating Marxism from the constraining traditions of social democracy, a concept advanced through Lenin's judgment of the historical task of his era. Lukács returns throughout this text to the theme of historical judgment via the generalization of the actuality of the revolution. He punctuates the deep dialectical heritage that Lenin inherited from Marx. Specifically, Lukács points out that recognizing an existing historical trend does not automatically ground revolutionary action. Instead, it is the understanding of, quote, the reality more real than isolated facts and tendencies, end quote. That is the totality of the social process that serves as a foundation for revolutionary practice. Lenin's standpoint is that returning to Marx was the precondition to overcoming the mechanistic and undialectical forms of vulgar Marxism. Therefore, returning to and advancing the crisis of 1848 manifests in its most acute and self-conscious form as the crisis of Marxism itself. Lukács argues that the actuality of the revolution as the core of Lenin's thought will remain evident throughout the latter's revolutionary career. He understood that recognizing the totality was crucial for furthering the struggle for proletarian socialism. So we'll take an overarching view of Lukács' broadly chronologically arranged analysis of the interrelated dialectical world historical moments. When Lenin recognized the actuality of the revolution through the dialectics of imperialism, the state, and compromise or orderly retreat. Despite the extraordinary Congress held in Basel, Switzerland in November 1912, which affirmed the Second International's commitment to preventing war, the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party, the largest party in the Reichstag at its time, made a fateful decision on August 4, 1914. The party, the first Marxist party, unanimously voted for war credits, thus endorsing Germany's entry into World War I. Lukács argues that the socialist current's differing attitudes in 1914 cannot be understood through psychological or moral evaluations. Instead, these positions were the direct consequence and culmination of their theoretical and tactical orientations leading up to the war. Lukács asserts that Lenin's superior position lies in the, and I quote, concrete articulation of the economic theory of imperialism with every political problem of the present, end quote. In his perpetually misinterpreted work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Lenin presents a dialectical critique of imperialism. He confronts Kautsky's undialectical concept of ultra-imperialism, which seeks to evade the contradictions that gave rise to imperialism. Lenin also addresses Hobson and Hilferding, who represent the antinomies of self-contradictory liberalism and revisionism, respectively, both expressing bourgeois aspirations. Lenin articulates a negative dialectical critique of the liberal dialectic, which states that the expansion of bourgeois society would dissipate coercive structures. Lukács observes that Lenin's theory effectively captures, quote, the concrete world situation created by imperialism, end quote. In essence, Lenin's recognition of imperialism as the inverse image of the dictatorship of the proletariat is the actuality of the revolution. So here we should address the very confused, perpetually confused category of imperialism. It should be brought to bear here in its connection with the Bonapartist state. The role of the state in capitalism should not be conflated with the aspiration of the bourgeois revolution, which aimed to subordinate the state to the general will of society. Rather, within the negative dialectic of capitalism, it transmutes into a necessary coercive apparatus. As Engels observed, the state serves to, quote, alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of order. And this power, arisen out of society but placing itself above it and alienating itself more and more from it, is the state, end quote. For Marxism, the Bonapartist state as such is imperialism. In other words, the latter is first and foremost a domestic issue. Imperialism involves the financialization and cartelization of capital. It is the armed occupation of society by the special bodies of armed men. The Bonapartist state is imperialism. No colonies required. In Lukács's study of the master dialectician, Lenin recognizes the dialectic between the state and revolution. State and revolution are interrelated concepts. The revolution is against the state, and the state is the product of the revolution. The state serves as the antagonist that the proletariat must struggle against and reveals that it is the primary tool of class domination, which the proletariat must capture for the first time in history in order to smash it. However, seizing control of the state does not necessarily transform it into an instrument of class struggle for the proletariat. Instead, this transformation is a task that depends on what the proletariat can achieve with it. According to Lukács, Lenin's brilliance lies in his historical judgment of his own time that the actuality of the revolution is generalized in, quote, the actuality of the problem of the state for the proletariat, end quote. The final lesson of Lukács's study of the essence of Lenin's thought is that of compromise, as a, quote, direct and logical consequence of the actuality of the revolution, end quote. Conditioned by the failure of the German Revolution of 1919, Lenin stood as the consciousness of the necessity for the consolidation of working class forces and orderly retreat. He understood the slogan of left-wing communism of the rejection of the principle of any compromise as infantile. In other words, this tactic fundamentally consists of rejecting decisive political struggles, which is a mask that conceals the standpoint of defeatism. Lukács articulates with precision the Leninist theory and tactic of compromise as the, and I quote, logical corollary of the Marxist dialectical historical recognition, that though men make their own history, they cannot do so in circumstances chosen by themselves. This follows from the knowledge that history always creates new conditions, that therefore moments in history when different tendencies intersect never recur in the same form, that tendencies can be judged favorable to the revolution today which are a mortal danger to it tomorrow. So Lenin brought to bear the actuality of the revolution through the judgment of the historical task of his time. So I've just led you through Lukács's intellectual survey of Lenin as a revolutionary and how he was able to grasp the totality in each particular historical situation. Why did I do this? Well, for us today, and this is a thought from my teacher, Chris Gatrone, founder of Platypus, for us today, Lenin's relevance is his absolute irrelevance. Although Lenin's era is gone, we still try to understand his thinking because the past continues to haunt us. continues to judge us. Socialism both appears as possible and necessary. Platypus is rooted in a judgment about the historical task of our own time. We live in the actuality of the counter-revolution led by the contemporary left. Is there any analogy from 1776 to 1917 with our wholly unmastered regression where the left drives the regression unconsciously forward? We are not in any similar situation from Jefferson to Lenin. The point of Platypus, in our humble way, is to shed light on this historical fact. The point of Platypus is to see the unfolding of the defeat of the revolution all around us in all its degraded forms. Platypus does not focus on drawing lessons from past defeats or questioning what could have been done differently. Instead, Platypus revolves around acknowledging defeat from the outset. It emphasizes that the left has experienced defeat, but is unwilling to admit it. The acknowledgement of this defeat is crucial as it shapes our current circumstances. Every brick in this wall, every sentence we read. Platypus is about recognizing the disavowal of this defeat as an ideological obstacle. Platypus's task of generalization is therefore vastly different and much broader in manner. Namely, it is in and through the activities of the tripod, led here in Charleston, through public fora, reading groups, coffee breaks, and journalism, the generalization to make palpable the death of the left as the only prospect of its possible reconstitution. In our moment, history is tasking Platypus to constitute the millennial left as an intelligible historical object, as this cohort, my cohort, endorses its inherited repetition compulsion in refusing to consciously reflect on its self-inflicted defeat. Following the millennials' unsuccessful and brief attempt at Kautsky party building and the trend of neo-social democracy, the Zoomers are moving away from the millennials and are now gravitating towards neo-Stalinism and an assortment of rad-lib pseudo-activities. As the memory of Marxism, the project of freedom, continues to diminish. The vastness of the lowered horizons and undigested memories of the left appear to Platypus like wandering through the desert amongst the historical wreckage of defeat. In Freud's time, capitalism's unmastered regression and disintegration into war resulted in profoundly modified symptoms within the consulting room. After the carnage of World War I, Freud had to consider the emergence of the brutality of industrialized warfare on the psyche of traumatized soldiers. For the latter, the primacy of the psychical conflict between the drives and the ego was displaced between the old peaceful ego and a new warlike one. Freud connected the symptoms of the conflict to the reified, internalized social authority, superego, and primal psychic drives, id, that were amplified by the war, which reflected the deepening crisis of bourgeois society writ large. Analogously, the trauma experienced by our subject, the left, is not merely the result of a single world historic event. Its deepening regression is both accumulative and recursive. Although the experience of World War I intensified Freud's pessimism about civilization and its discontents, he was undeterred in his mission as a psychoanalyst. Likewise, as we confront increasing the disintegration and disorganization in the degraded repetitions of the left, Platypus must constellate these symptoms and try to hear the echoes of the past, however distant and distorted. Only Platypus has the ability to transform the arid and desolate landscape surrounding us into a strategic advantage, enabling us to cultivate, if I may be permitted the term, desert power. That is, the strength to bring to bear the force of the stalled dialectic. As articulated by Omer Hussein, and I quote, "This is what it means to say that we aim to provoke and organize the pathology of the left, or to perform psychoanalysis on the left, to render it as coherently objectifiable symptomology as possible so that it might be cured," end quote. Our tripod activities are an essential part of this procedure. Namely, they are what enable the working through and digestion of the legacy of the old, new, post-political, and now millennial left, to shed critical light on the repression of the failure and unconscious repetition of the eternal return of the same old ideas, same old protest movements, organizational forms, fetishes, and strategies of these failed lefts. I use the term working through very intentionally here. It is a critical dimension of psychoanalysis. The working through of a fantasy or trauma is essential to the talking cure. It is not simply a cognitive apprehension or a theoretical correction. Rather, the effective, libidinal, unconscious investments of the pathological repetition must be brought to light in such a way that it effectuates change in the subject, which only occurs in the process of treatment itself. As Freud writes, we must lift the repression. In our case, the repression of defeat of the left by the left. The struggle does not continue. It is the same with our subject, that is making palpable the death of the left. It is not simply a matter of cognitive integration, understanding an idea, as much as I enjoy them myself, watching Spencer or Chris on YouTube. Rather, it is a continual working through via our panels, teach-ins, public for coffee breaks, reading groups, etc. It is in the doing. One must continually re-recruit oneself to this task. Like any existential wager, you have to commit to it first. The proof is to be derived by the incarnation of these activities. Like Rilke's commanding stone, Platypus in a way issues the imperative, you must change your life. That is, if you are still serious about changing the world. To reconstitute the possibility of emancipatory politics, you must turn the telescope around and look at the world through the lens of the tradition of the vanquished modern freedom project. To achieve this, you must engage in Platypus. So, my statement here, provocative statement, maybe not applying to you in this room, maybe so. So what if you were to stop evading and voluntarily accept the burden of history that has been squarely placed on your shoulders? Platypus is the consciousness of this burden and mission. Platypus is about untimely meditations. So if you accepted this task, how much good could you do? Well, you have to find out. Okay, so that's all I have to say to you for now. Open it up for questions. And one thing I want to say about questions, that Platypus seeks to abolish thought taboos. So any dangerous ideas you might have, questions that may be countenanced as offensive elsewhere, the rule is much like psychoanalysis, you can say what's on your mind. And that includes challenging Platypus, that includes challenging the concept of the left, or any questions you may have. And so this is a space for untimely questions and hopefully answers. So, Zena, please. Oh.
Speaking to that.
Thank you. Okay.
And I may be typing because I want to recall the details of your question. So.
Sounds good. Okay. And like, it's not like, this is more of a clarifying question than anything. Mm-hmm. But you were talking about like the opportunists, and I was just confused because you mentioned like their support of Lenin, but also like support for the maintaining the way things are. I don't know if like maybe I just misheard.
Opportunism.
Yeah.
And so the point I was making, so opportunism, it has a different definition than our everyday understanding of opportunism. So opportunism, you elect me to office and I use the power of my office to secure material wealth or what have you. Opportunism in Marxism means something very different from this old tradition. Namely, it's the fact of you would be elected and you would start to attempt to you would administer capitalism in the name of socialism. So it could be police reform or universal health care or whatever else the infantile left proffers today, as it were, in the name of left or Marxism. So opportunism means the adaptation to capitalism while raising the banner of socialism. And so it's not necessarily done out of, let's say, some type of malintent or something like that, but it is a capitulation to capitalism. And so the opportunists, even though they disagreed with Lenin, just like, conservatives or liberals, progressives, they have to admire his political genius, as it were. So that's the point I was making. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay. So in like reference to compromise, how do you mitigate?
No, precisely. Okay. So no, that's a very good question. I was hoping someone was going to bring that up. So there's a fundamental difference of compromise in Lenin's time and, let's say, a compromise in our time. So Lenin would compromise on tactics and not on principles, and these principles were not abstractions. The principle was embodied by mass proletarian parties around the world with millions of people in them. So it wasn't, a sect of 5 people saying, okay, well, we've got to support the Democrats for this election. We've got to defeat that fascist Trump or something like that. So Lenin could make compromises, let's say with early entryism into the Labor Party, as it were, because there was an independent independent, mass proletarian socialist movement that was worldwide. Today, that does not exist. So any compromise, really, it transmutes into simply liquidation into the Democrats. Is that capito?
That makes sense.
Yeah. And again, this is what I'm bringing to bear here. These are just spirits of the past, right? This is just a conjuring of something that no longer exists. Comments, questions, provocations?
You used the specific term administrative state earlier on in the talk, and I don't know if that was specifically meant to evoke what's kind of the project of the modern conservatives to abolish the modern American administrative state, or just, could you speak a little bit more about how you were using that term in the context of?
Very good, very good.
Yeah.
So let me, and I know it seems like I rapidly went through this presentation, let me bring to bear some definitions, as it were, right? And so, as I said, let's look at the bourgeois revolutionaries, we can look at its apotheosis, its highest form of reflection, namely Hegel, and we can look at its corresponding, let's say, revolutionaries from Danton, Robespierre, Washington, Jefferson, all of the rest of the bourgeois revolutionaries, as it were. The idea was the state was going to serve society, that society would subordinate the state to its will, so the state would serve to expand the scope of freedom. What occurs, and as I said in my presentation, with the Industrial Revolution, we have the development of machinery, which reduces socially necessary labor time. It should be labor saving, but since society is still mediated by value, as it were, we don't need as many workers. It doesn't make work superfluous, it makes worker superfluous. What does this create, right? With the proletarian socialist movement, it creates class struggle. So what Marx called the Bonapartist state, and what later Adorno would call the administrative state, the state's function is to mitigate and attenuate class struggle, as it were. And so the administrative state, yes, the conservatives, namely the Democrats, and their loyal opposition, the Republicans, they have to maintain the administrative state to a certain degree. Even with the Republicans, let's say, propaganda and their bluster, the administrative state is necessary in capitalism because society is crying out for socialism. Every unemployed person, every armed occupation of society by the police, right? Every time a worker demands bourgeois right, let's say fair wages and so on, as it were, all of this has to be attenuated and ordered by the state, so to speak. So even the Republicans bluster that we're going to dismantle it. As Woodrow Wilson said, there's really 4 branches of government, and the one that really matters is the administrative branch, as it were. The Constitution is something we pay homage to, but this document has no bearing on our current situation, as it were. And so this is the utopianism of Marxism. It's not we're going to expand the state and we're going to give people health care, as it were. The transitional phase, the dictatorship of the proletariat, this would be the slow and perhaps a little more rapid dismantling of the state. And so who would rule? Society would rule. That's why it's called socialism, as it were, that our sociality would be unleashed and we would reach the highest form of government, and that would be no government, right? And this is, as I said, this is the messianic time that's shooting through the past to our present time that seems so, bizarre to us, is that it would be anarchy. The question is, should there be a transitional period? So the anarchists believe we could just jump to a stateless society. The Marxists thought there would have to be this transitional program, the dictatorship of the proletariat, as society works out what does it mean to be free. And this is why Marxism, as many bright intellectuals we have in here, and myself a little lower down on the tier, as it were, we could debate all day long of what society should look like. It's not a matter of intellectuals getting together and drawing up blueprints for society. Rather, as Marx says in the Class Struggles of France, I think, think that the revolutionaries come with no blueprints. Rather, they're the midwives of society. That society is already pregnant with freedom, and we just have to help it give birth to the tendency. So what freedom means in the future can't be determined now, because the people living in freedom would therefore be unfree to determine what future is. So, and again, I'm using the term durcharbeiten, working through, that society in the dictatorship of the proletariat would have to work through what does freedom look like. And that's why Marx only spoke about socialism negatively, the absence of the state, of coercion. The way I like to put it, that Spencer said, is that the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat would be the last heir to the pharaoh. It'd be the last time that man would have to lift his hand against another man. And that's part of Platypus too. It's bringing to bear this negativity of the utopians of this time, that revolutionaries lived and died for this. They believed it was possible. And so the question that we could pose in the scope of our research today is, do we still believe that? Okay, I know that was long-winded. Hopefully that unfolded something for you that was of use. Yeah. And as always, if you guys don't have any questions, I'll give you the answers and you ask me the right questions. Yes, nothing? Okay. Well, I'd be interested to hear from Will and yourself, Ethan, since this is your second round, and now that you've had your platypus education, does anything strike you differently, redundant, new? Not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
Meditate on it. Yeah.
You know, something that still arises to me after going, I went through the syllabus last year and I've heard you give this talk before. The concern that always arises to me is less regarding sort of the history of the project and more about the intervention. And I guess this is, less of a question, more of a statement, but I'm just always left feeling a little wanting regarding the sort of psychical nature of the project. Like, what does it mean when we say that we're doing a psychoanalysis of the left? I feel like I'm often left lacking in terms of methodology and what constitutes these kinds of interventions. So you can speak on that, but also that's something that I focused on much more this year than I did last year when I was just sort of encountering the brute content of the thing.
Very good. Excellent question. So, yeah, Platypus as the psychoanalyst of the left. So let me make what will seem to be a digressive point that will lead to your question. So the point of Platypus is not to be the monastic Marxist, right? It's not for us to go to our wall and we read the text of Marx, as it were, and then we go around campus and say, we're the better Marxists, right? We know better, as it were, right? The point of the reading group is the panels itself. And so this may become more difficult in the future, and we can speak to that, but the new left, and now the millennial left, and so on. And so when Platypus was first founded, Chicago, and the SDS, what they told the millennials, my cohort, was, do not follow us. Do not follow the model of the 60s, as it were. Then as the millennial left unfolded, and we're using these terms loosely, so to speak, they repressed that, as it were. It's like, oh no, we do have something to tell you beyond our defeat, as it were. And so Spencer uses the term making their voices crack. It's drawing out their memory of the endeavors and politics of their youth, when there was the idea they could establish a socialist party. They could create a new left. Or for the millennials, we did have our Kautskyan party moment. But all of this is liquidated. What's the term? Like an old man now, memory hold, right? It's like, oh, no, we never wanted to build a socialist party. We were just trying to support Bernie. And it's like, no, that's a lie. You were. And so while they're on the panels and they're, speaking and so on, if we can bring out that repressed memory, make their voices crack, like, oh, there was a moment and we missed it, that's what's repressed, and that's what we can still learn from, as it were. So the intervention is through the panels. And so the danger is to become so infused with the reading group. As I say, will become it's our religious exercise, as it were, right? it's to bring these texts, and there is something you've said about beating them over the head, right? So we can be Socratic about it, but bring these texts to these old new leftists and now these aging millennials and try to summon the ghost of their youth. And can they still speak about the aim and scope of the utopia they had in mind? And well, I don't know if that satisfies you. The only other thing I want to say is, and I experience this, we want you to feel wanting. So platypus, the saying is, we want it to get stuck in your throat. You can't spit it out, nor can you swallow it, as it were. So that ambivalence, that anxiety, you have to maintain that, you have to objectify that, and you do that through the activities of platypus. So I can't offer you a consolation, but just a continual task. Yeah.
Awesome.
Please, yeah.
Start jogging. Start going. Yeah. It's time to run. You gotta get some steps in.
Okay. So this isn't like this is like, I don't know. So but like considering like less of a focus on just the readings and broader interactions with like other organizations and like the role of paneling, how can an organization like Platypus effectively function in a city like Charleston where existent leftist organizations refuse to be on panels? Like Ethan's always like, even like people in there like, no. So then is it even like effective to have this something here?
That's a great question.
Okay.
And I'm in the same situation in Columbia. It's dry up there, as it were. So, Ethan and I are still determined to put on this panel. We've got, two panelists thus far. But if a panel is not an opportunity, I know them. We can talk about this at the pop night. There are still old new leftists around, and we want to take, and I mean this in a twofold manner, their dying confessions. Namely, most of them have died out of the left, and then also before they leave this earth, as it were. And so if we can't make the past speak, if we can't conjure spirits through the panel, then there are other opportunities through interviews, but you're going to have to be an investigative reporter. You're going to have to track these people down because most of the time they're living normal lives and they don't want anything to do with the left. But, as a mature, intelligent, rational, moral young person, you can get them to speak. It just requires some, as I said, investigative journalist skills. So, yeah.
Did Libby reject the offer?
No. She's willing. We were looking for some other people. We're looking for a new leftist to be on there. Something I took away from the panel this year, or they were teaching this year, was last year when you gave it, this was before my recruitment to Platypus, I focused much more on the history of the left as in its totality. But this year, I'm more so focused on the history of the history of freedom that's tasked to us through the left, which is it's sort of a similar but different move, which I felt was much more enlightening than it was last year. The sort of the history of the left presents us with a task that is burdening, but also I find somewhat freeing. Can
you say more how it liberates you?
I think it liberates us in the sense that, or frees me in the sense that it gives, what's the Louis Menand quote? He says, Marxism gives meaning to the tragedy or something, that's modernity.
Right.
Sort of that the task of the left and the task of freedom imposed on it gives a sort of reflective meaning to it all, like sort of understanding and a better metric of, or an object of reflection, I guess, that gives, like I said, this meaning to this craziness that we call modernity.
Well said, yeah.
Thank you.
I would agree with that. Anything else? And remember, knock down your restrictions, your thought taboos. What's your name?
Jacob.
Jake Daniel. Okay.
This is not so much something that you might have addressed, but it was in a previous conversation, Ethan and I were talking about what little gains the left makes when it has some power, albeit I wouldn't recognize the Democrats as the left, as it were. But what is the what are leftists to do in situations where we have power, but not quite enough to, go down the entire laundry list? Are we to make any kind of gains, or is it just wins for capitalism if we try to do something that lifts up the working class?
That's a good question. If you could hold on to the mic. And I'm being earnest here, so I don't want to speak past each other, as it were, so we need some Socratic definitions, as it were. First is, what do you mean by the left? You've articulated not the Democrats. And then, what constitutes gains for you? And then finally, what would it mean to have a modicum of power, as it were? And I'm being earnest, I really want to ensure we're on the same page and talking about the same subject, right?
In lieu of having a Labor Party, I think the definition of the left is kind of superfluous in that while there are examples of, I don't know specifically if CPUSA has actually put forward any elected officials, or sponsored any elected officials, but I do know of some people who ran on the Democrat ticket with the endorsement of DSA, and they have done some reformism. I can't name specifically anything they might have done, but obviously anything.
General outline is fine. Yeah.
Sorry?
A general outline is fine. Yeah.
But generally, these are reforms meant to help working class people. And so what I was asking is, are these actually wins? And if not, then what are people who have to run on the Democrat ticket while also being leftist actually to do?
So I'm determined today not to give you any positive answers, as it were. Maybe we can talk afterwards.
Yes.
But I really want to maintain my position in Platypus here as bringing to bear the past and how it judges us, right? So there's something we need to first disambiguate, as it were, between the left and social movements, or the left and the workers' movement for socialism, as it were. The left was always the critical intellectual consciousness of these movements. They were reflecting on what these movements were doing. So think about what Marx says in his 1843 letter to Arnold Ruge: we offer no roasted partridges to fly into the mouths of the workers. We're not telling the workers what to do, but rather we're clarifying what the workers are doing themselves. And so Marx and Engels were highly critical. That's why, Kautsky and Bernstein would say those two old men in England that nobody could please, as it were, right? And so the question is, if there is no independent working class movement that is not tied to what the great abolitionist Thaddeus Stevens and that bohemian overseas socialist named Karl Marx both called the slave power, namely the Democrats, we could pose a question is, are there really any gains for the working class that is not simply reconstituting their own self-domination via capitalism? And so with an independent socialist party in days gone by, let's look at the SPD, the elected officials, they would vote no to everything. No to universal health care, no to police reform, not one man, not one penny to this rotten system. They were elected to make speeches denouncing capitalism. So what's the natural question? Well, what about the working class? So this is what they would do, is civic social organizing. They would organize the working class without the state. They would organize labor legally or illegally. They would organize doctors to provide abortions legally or illegally. That's why the struggle for socialism was the self-organization of society. And so what I would say is, we're at year zero, to quote James Vaughan, Platypus founder. And so just to hint at, there's an entire field of civic social organizing. There's an entire field of society where needs are not being addressed. So from days gone by, socialists would address those needs and organize working class on the ground. And Mr. Capitalist, Mr. Biden, Mr. Trump, you have your election and we'll deal with you as the time comes, or whoever. So again, it's only a negative rendition, as it were, of how the past could speak to us, but something that Marx recognized and so on. And this is, we hear the same old story today. This is from his 1850 address to the Communist League, is that the workers must run independent candidates, and he uses this term, and we must not listen to the cries of the Democrats that we're going to allow the forces of reaction to win, as it were. And that's when I say return to 1848, that is the consciousness of 1848. That's what Marx and Engels learned from 1848, namely that the workers have to have their own independent social movement. And so that's why I said it's year zero. We're not sure what forms of the left would emerge, but I would wager it's going to have to be completely independent of the capitalist political parties.
So essentially what you're saying is to redo legislation to enable greater mass and social movements to kind of, to essentially, instead of using the reins of government to push forward a goal, instead to kind of open up the floodgates for wider mass movement. Is that essentially what you're trying to say?
Well, so I'll say this again only from the past. The independent socialist parties around the world is that they wouldn't enact any legislation. They would organize civil society, as it were. The only reason they would get elected is to denounce capitalism. And so the idea is that they would instill in a sense of people, which is very lost for us today, that the state does not cover the complete scope of society. They would organize outside of the state. And again, whether that would work today, I don't know. And I think we're bringing to bear the past, but we need to be open about social reality. A new form, the left, may emerge today, and the existing left may not even recognize it. The existing left might do what it always does. When something different comes along, fascism, white supremacy, like it's just the automatic go-to of anything different that's occurring, as it were. And so it's being open to social reality, but at the same time, it's recognizing that socialists, they organize outside of the state. They were not concerned about elections and legislation and so on and so forth. Is that right or wrong? It appears wrong, because Marxism failed. That's my encouraging thought for you, Jane. But anyways, that's, yeah.